All right, this week in Exercise Science Lab, we're talking about the squatting pattern, all things kinesiology. All right, so let's begin. What is the everyday move associated with the squatting pattern? Pretty simple. I want to be able to sit down and stand back up. If I give this to a client or a patient, I might call it a sit to stand, right? So standing up from a couch, standing up from a toilet, standing up from a chair. All right, if we get into ADLs, all right, so that's your everyday move. Now, if I'm an athlete, my everyday move might be jumping up and blocking a spike. It might be grabbing a rebound and getting a putback, right? That's my squat. That's why I work this into my everyday routine for my training, whether that's for athletic purposes or just activities of daily living. Remember, ADLs, that's what physical therapists use, occupational therapists use when it comes down to how independent your patient is around their house, right? So I have a lot of clients that just want to stay in their two-story house where their laundry is still in their basement. So we work on things, everyday strength type exercises, so they can maintain that quality of life in their particular house. All right, your joint movements, actions, planes, etc. Let's break that down a little bit. Let's go through planes first. All right, remember, it's all about my stance for the most part. If my toes are pointed straight ahead, and I can do a pretty strict sagittal plane squat and back up. We rarely do that. You're usually going to bring your feet out a little bit. A pretty universal cue might be about a hip width stance with your toes pointed out to about 30 degrees. There's been some good studies on self-selecting a stance, especially like in the FMS deep squat and different squatting assessments. So you want to have them about 30 degrees externally rotated and then see how that squat looks. And what you're looking for is tracking over the toes, that their thigh is in line with the line of their metatarsals or their feet, and that they don't have some sort of left-right discrepancy, that the right ankle isn't externally rotated too much of the right hip, that the right knee isn't falling too much forward over the toes as opposed to the left foot. You're looking for these left-right imbalances. But because we've externally rotated your hips, now we've brought the transverse plane into play along with some frontal plane. So as I squat down and my knees go out a little bit, not excessively, all right, my knees are still over my toes, I do have some external rotation and internal rotation going on as I drive back up, all right? A little bit of abduction on the way down, a little bit of adduction on the way back, all right? So we're bringing in these different planes, therefore these different muscles, and that's what we want. All right, so as far as joint movements, let's do your jam analysis. The three primary joints are the hips, the knees, and the ankles. Let's talk about the hips first. And whenever we do a jam analysis, we're thinking about what part of the movement. Well, keep in mind this, your muscle contractions. As far as your muscle contractions, that's your eccentric contraction, your concentric contraction. If you're going to program this, you can program tempos. Let's say your tempo is 3, 0, or 2, 0, 1. 2 is my eccentric controlling contraction down in 2 seconds, and then I'm not going to pause at the bottom, and then I'm going to stand back up with my concentric causing motion contraction. Your eccentric controls motion, your concentric causes motion. Your isometric contraction prevents motion. So let's say you program a tempo of 2, 1, 1. What that is 2 seconds on the way down, pause for a second, 1 second on the way back up. All right, 2 second eccentric, 1 second isometric, 1 second concentric. All right, so know your eccentric, concentric, isometric, and what that tempo looks like if you're going to program this. The reason we might do a pause squat or that tempo might involve an isometric contraction at the bottom, or actually sitting down to a box if you're going to do box squats, is that you're going to reduce the stretch reflex, the stretch shortening cycle, the muscle spindle response, the proprioceptor response. All right, all these kinesiology terms we've been kind of going through. All these stretch sensors in your muscles that when they get stretched, the elasticity of the fascia and your muscle and then the nervous system is activated, those muscles want to contract like a rubber band, right? And so when I go down, all right, and jump, if I go down, I want to stretch. You're taking that potential energy, right? And you're turning it into kinetic energy, right? So I'm loading a bunch of potential energy into my system and then driving up with kinetic energy. If you go down and sit for 2 seconds, all right, with that isometric tempo pause in the middle, I'm going to reduce all of those reactions and then just have to generate some strength and power alone based off those muscle fibers coming together. All right? We'll talk about that in a second. Let's do your jam analysis first. Your jam analysis then. So my hips, knees, and ankles are involved here. My agonist, hip extender, this is hip extension, knee extension, ankle extension. Remember we talked about triple extension, hip, ankle, and knee, all right? So my hip extension, knee extension, ankle, and plantar flexion. I'm sitting down, all right? My hip agonist is the glutes, my hip synergist is the hamstrings, and my hip antagonist to hip extension is hip flexion, my hip flexors, all right? My fixators for this whole movement, we can just say the core and your spinal muscles, right? In order to maintain this fixated spine so I can be strong and drive up, all right? My primary movers for knee extension are my quadriceps, my antagonists are my hamstrings, a little bit my gastrocnemius, and then my primary, in this position, my primary ankle plantar flexions are my soleus. Your tibialis, your posterior tibialis is at play, maybe a synergist. For ankle plantar flexion, your soleus is going to be the primary plantar flexion here. As you come up and come through this motion, you will have tension in your gastroc as your knee extends, so your gastrocnemius will also come into play as a plantar flexor. All right, so there's your hip, knee, and ankle jam analysis. All right, now as far as variations go, oh, and then the stabilizers, we talked about the rotator cuff being the primary stabilizers of the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint. We could talk about your obturator, your piriformis, your external rotators being the stabilizers of your hip joint. Remember that, all right? So when someone comes in with pain, it might be a little deeper than something you can just palpate, like your gluteus maximus or gluteus medius. It might be something deeper like your piriformis. All right, if someone can't stabilize your hip joint too much, and that might be something to go after and understand. And then understand why that might cause some sciatica problems, some nerve issues running down the back of the leg, etc., all involved with the stabilizers of the hip joint. All right, now, variations. If I use a kettlebell, all right, so my air squat looks good, my body weight squat looks good, that's my unloaded pattern. All right, my next position might be a half rack or racked kettlebell, a unilateral rack kettlebell. So this is going to throw already, this weight is going to pull me into lateral flexion. So this is challenging me in the frontal plane, right? And then as I squat, it's going to continue to challenge me in the frontal plane as I come down. Because it's front loaded, it's pulling me forward a little bit as well. So that's a little bit of a rotational component. So there's going to be a challenge in the sagittal plane as well. And then it still remains the transverse plane as well, all right? So one variation I like a lot, all right? Knock out 6 or 8 per side, and just always sensing for instability or challenges there. A goblet squat, this is almost kind of a corrective motion, or just, I like it as a nice cue for teaching the squat, because as much as this is a 40-pound dumbbell, and a 40-pound dumbbell is not a light dumbbell, but for squats, it's a pretty light dumbbell, right? So I'm not going to train necessarily for strength and power with the goblet squat, but it helps counterbalance my weight. It helps load my fixators, so my erector spinae, my core muscles, my postural muscles are working pretty hard. I wouldn't rest on my elbows like this, but just so I can keep talking, right? It also just front loads me and allows me to counterbalance to where I can get a pretty clean squat up and down, and there is some loading there. But sometimes there's more loading on my forearms and wrists than it is, but I do like that squat from the standpoint of just learning a good, healthy, upright squat. Before we load with something like a barbell, all right, a barbell back squat, all right, and if I'm going to do a bilateral barbell back squat, we're just going to stay tucked in here. If I go into this wide position sometimes, that throws my spine and posture off. We're always mindful of the spine and posture first, so my elbows are going to be tucked in here. What we talked about in lab this week, though, is the overhead squat and what this does to my normal squat, all right? So the picture I have for the video, thumbnail, is to stand here, right, just so you can see my feet, and then I'm dropping into an overhead squat position. So can I maintain that position, looking straight ahead, and come back up, all right? So that's an example of a 3 on the FMS, but that's going to challenge the mobility of my thoracic spine, my shoulder mobility, and kind of this extreme position at the bottom, all right? So an overhead squat position, even with the light, kind of a weightless PVC pipe, is still a good squat that's going to challenge quite a bit more. If my pectoral major isn't stretched out, if my shoulder mobility isn't there, you're going to see some compensation with that overhead squat. So a few simple bilateral variations. If I want to get into unilateral variations, I can do any number of single leg squats here, all right, without the hop. All right, so some sort of single leg squat, and then we do box squats. That's for another day, all right? So functional anatomy, variations, jam, test in the rehab setting, planes, just make sure we got everything. Oh, last thing is the force length relationship. Last thing, if I squat from an 18-inch box, what did we talk about? Two things, is that the line of pull in my joints, because my hip angle is 90 degrees, my knee angle is 90 degrees, my ankle angle is 90 degrees. This is pretty optimal for the line of pull of the major muscles, the primary movers that are going to help me squat. All right? Plus, this is about an optimal stretch length, 100 to 130% we said, of its resting length to help optimize the contraction of the muscles, the overlap of the sarcomeres, the actin and myosin, right? And that overlap of those cross bridges that we need a lot of that overlap. When I squat down to a 12-inch box, all right, now I lose a little bit of that rotary torque, that range of motion, that we get a little bit of a destabilizing pull at the joint. So we lose a little bit of that rotary torque, plus my muscles are stretched out more, and if they go beyond 130%, again, kind of an arbitrary number, but based on some research, if we just stretch out these muscles more, we lose some of that optimal cross bridge muscle contraction, so we lose that. That's the force length relationship, muscle length force relationship, right? So if I go deeper, it's going to be a little tougher to get through that spot, all right? That's why we all like to squat here, but there's a big difference in what muscles are at play, all right? And then the deeper I go, we talked about the biarticular muscles involved with the squat, that if my hamstring if my knee is flexed this far, my gastrocnemius is a little more relaxed, my hamstring isn't going to be optimally stretched. It's still forced, it's sort of forceful, it's still helping, but it's going to have a little more concentration on my glutes. My gluteus has to work to get out of this hole before I get to a good spot here again, that my hamstrings can kick on, my quads can kick on, and then I can drive through. All right, so if you're working on squat depth, you might work off of a 10-inch box, a 12-inch box, maybe a deficit. There's different things we can do to work on each little range of motion. Before we just get to your kind of functional everyday pattern or range of motion where you want to jump. I'm not going to go down much lower than this when I go to jump to try to dunk or rebound or something like in my basketball game, but there's benefits to getting a little more stretch and working muscles to that full range of motion. All right, I believe that's it. It was a little longer than I want, but I want you to cover all that so you know the kinesiology breakdown of the squatting pattern. I'll see you next week. Let me find the button.